The sun was setting over the horizon, casting orange and red hues over a small garage far from the tourist-packed beaches. The air was thick with motor oil, burnt rubber, and a trace of ocean salt. Ricardo, a wiry and broad-shouldered from years of labor, leaned over a worn Volkswagen Beetle. Focused and skilled, he had earned a reputation in his neighborhood for rebuilding engines to perfection. Quiet and hard-working, Ricardo dreamed of owning a garage, a small home, and a yard for kids to play. For now, his work was his passion and purpose. Little did he know how deeply something as fleeting as a kiss could affect him, or how quickly love, intertwined with betrayal, could sow the seeds of something far more complex. But for now, Ricardo was just a young man with humble dreams and extraordinary talent. Ricardo's favorite car was a sleek black 1968 Chevrolet Impala, a powerhouse that stood out among the worn-down sedans and compact cars that typically rolled into the garage. The Impala belonged to Antonio, a grizzled, middle-aged man with a face etched by years of exposure to the harsh Mexican sun. Antonio never revealed the car's true owner, and Ricardo never asked. It didn't matter. To Ricardo, the Impala was a masterpiece, and he treated it with reverence each time it appeared. The car's elegant contours and polished chrome trim reflected the light like a mirror, commanding attention in the dimly lit garage. Its presence seemed to dominate the space, casting long shadows under the flickering fluorescent lights. On those nights, Ricardo often stayed late. Once everyone else had gone, he would take a rag and meticulously polish the steering wheel and dashboard until they gleamed. When he was certain he was alone, Ricardo would slide into the driver's seat. With one hand gripping the oversized steering wheel and the other draped casually over the door, he'd imagine himself as one of the wealthy men he'd seen in American movies, confident and at ease behind the wheel of such a magnificent machine. Occasionally, he'd imagine a cigar nestled between his fingers, watching invisible smoke spiral lazily into the air. He would grin, closing his eyes briefly to envision himself driving down the coastal highway in the Impala, the wind tugging at his hair, and the rhythmic crash of waves in the background. Yet, these fantasies always concluded the same way, with Ricardo stepping out of the car, locking it meticulously, and returning to his everyday life. The Impala wasn't his, but that didn't stop him from cherishing it or treating it like a prized possession. 7 months later, Ricardo arrived home one evening to find his mother radiating joy. She had arranged for him to marry Luciana, a reserved but undeniably beautiful woman from a nearby town. "Ricardo, I have the best news!" his mother exclaimed. "Luciana has agreed to be your wife. Her family is thrilled, and I just know you'll make her happy." Ricardo, ever respectful and dutiful, didn't object. Truthfully, he was content with the prospect. The idea of building a life with Luciana, someone warm and kind, gave him a sense of direction beyond his devotion to cars and tools. Their wedding was an intimate celebration, filled with family, marigolds fragrance, and bursts of laughter. Ricardo wore a crisp white shirt, his hair carefully combed, while Luciana shone in a simple yet graceful dress. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was more than enough. Married life proved to be exactly what Ricardo had hoped for. He woke early, worked long hours at the garage, and returned each evening to Luciana's radiant smile and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals. Their modest home brimmed with love, even if it lacked extravagance. Ricardo cherished sitting at the table, listening to Luciana recount her day, her laughter ringing like a melody. Though his work was exhausting and physically demanding, his nights were filled with her tenderness and unwavering attention. 5 years into their marriage, Ricardo Moreno's lifelong dream became reality. The grand opening of Taller Moreno, his very own auto shop on a bustling street corner in Cancun, was a moment of triumph. The freshly painted sign gleamed above the door, and inside, the smell of new tools mingled with the promise of success. The journey from employee to business owner hadn't been easy, and Ricardo hadn't done it alone. One day, Antonio, the man who frequently brought the cherished 1968 Impala to the shop, approached Ricardo with an unexpected proposal. "Ricardo," Antonio said gruffly, "I know you've been dreaming about this shop. The owner of the Impala is willing to help finance it. You should take the offer." Though initially cautious about accepting a loan, the opportunity was too generous to decline. Within a year, Ricardo's tireless work paid off yet again. The garage's profits, combined with countless hours of effort, allowed him to purchase a modest but charming house on the town's edge, a home for him and Luciana, a symbol of his determination and hard work. However, Ricardo didn't realize that the house marked the beginning of an unraveling he couldn't foresee. The first signs of trouble in his idyllic life were subtle, almost imperceptible. At first, Luciana's afternoons spent socializing with the neighborhood wives seemed harmless. Being naturally outgoing, Ricardo didn't begrudge her companionship. "If it makes you happy, mi amor, go enjoy time with your friends," he had said one evening, wiping grease from his hands after a long day. She had smiled, brushing a soft kiss against his cheek. "You're too good to me, Ricardo." But over time, her outings became more frequent, lasting longer into the evenings. By the time Ricardo returned home from grueling 12-hour shifts, the house was often empty except for the faint trace of her perfume lingering in the air. The hot meals and warm smiles that once welcomed him had vanished, replaced by a quiet coldness. When Luciana was home, she seemed distant, distracted by neighborhood gossip or the latest fads shared among her friends. "Luciana," Ricardo said one evening, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay? You seem different." She avoided his gaze, shaking her head. "I'm just tired, Ricardo. That's all." The shared laughter and simple dinners that once bonded them were replaced with silence or excuses of exhaustion. Their intimacy faded into a distant memory. Ricardo couldn't recall the last time she had touched him the way she used to. One night, summoning his courage, Ricardo brought up his concerns. Luciana brushed him off with a wave of her hand. "You're always working, Ricardo," she said flatly. "I'm tired. We can talk later." Ricardo had always dreamed of having children, filling the house with the joyful chaos of little feet and laughter. When he mentioned this, Luciana's reaction blindsided him. "No, Ricardo, not now," she said sharply. "Why not? We're stable now. Our house. The garage. What's stopping us?" he asked, his voice heavy with desperation. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not ready," she said firmly. "Do you even know what pregnancy does to a woman's body? I'm not about to ruin my figure. Maybe not ever." Her words hit him like a blow. Her refusal didn't just crush his hopes. It began to unravel the carefully built life he'd worked so hard for. Ricardo had no idea that while he spent his days under the hoods of cars, pouring his soul into his work, Luciana had found a rhythm to her life, a rhythm that no longer included him. What started as innocent afternoons with the neighborhood wives had morphed into something far more secretive. The group of women, many discontented with their own married lives, began exploring Cancun's vibrant nightlife. The city's bars welcomed them eagerly, their laughter merging with pulsing music and the clinking of glasses. They savored the attention of strangers, reveling in the fleeting escape from the confines of their domestic roles. For Luciana, it was exhilarating. After years of being the dutiful wife to a man she barely knew before their wedding, these nights out felt like freedom. At first, it was harmless, just a little playful banter and flirtation to break the monotony. But as time went on, Luciana became more immersed in the thrill of it all. The admiring gazes of strangers who didn't ask for anything in return gave her a rush that her life at home no longer provided. The more she indulged in this world, the more detached she grew from the life Ricardo had worked so hard to build. Ricardo remained oblivious to the changes creeping into their marriage. His long days at the garage shielded him from the reality unfolding behind the scenes. To him, Luciana was still the light of his life, the person who made every grueling hour worthwhile. Their arranged marriage no longer mattered to him. What mattered was that he loved her now, completely and unconditionally. But Ricardo's life was unraveling, and the toll was evident. The steady hands that once deftly worked with tools now trembled, and the spark in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a heavy weariness. Antonio, the familiar owner of the sleek black Impala, noticed the change immediately. The cheerful mechanic who once hummed while working had grown silent, his demeanor distant and strained. One evening, Antonio arrived at the garage after hours to pick up his car and found Ricardo sitting alone on a stool, staring vacantly at the floor with idle tools in his hands. "Hey, kid, what's going on?" Antonio asked, his rough voice breaking the silence. Ricardo forced a weak smile and shook his head. "Nothing, just tired." Antonio didn't buy it. Studying him for a long moment, he placed a firm hand on Ricardo's shoulder. "Come on, let's go for a drive." Though hesitant, Ricardo eventually agreed. Antonio led him to the Impala, its polished exterior gleaming under the dim garage lights. The moment Ricardo slid into the passenger seat, a sense of comfort washed over him. This car had always been special to him, and tonight it felt like a safe haven. They drove through Cancun's bustling streets in silence, the city alive with music and laughter. Eventually, Antonio parked by the coast, where the waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks. Reaching into the glove compartment, he pulled out a cigar and handed it to Ricardo, along with a lighter. Ricardo hesitated, then lit the cigar with unsteady hands. His first puff made him cough, but Antonio chuckled. "It's not about how you start," he said. "It's about how you finish." The quiet hum of the engine, the scent of the cigar mingling with salty sea air, and Antonio's steady presence loosened something in Ricardo. Words spilled out, his fears about Luciana, her growing distance, her refusal to have children, and her endless absences. He confessed the gnawing doubts that had consumed him. Antonio listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Ricardo finished, Antonio leaned back in his seat with a heavy sigh. "Listen, kid," he began. "I've seen a lot in my time. Good people destroyed by the ones they trusted most." Ricardo frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Antonio turned to him, his gaze sharp. "I'm not just a guy who loves cars. I'm a hitman. I work for people who don't forgive mistakes. Part of my job is finding the truth, surveillance, digging into lives. I know how to uncover secrets." Ricardo stared at him, stunned into silence. Antonio took another puff of his cigar before continuing. "I can find out what your wife's really doing when you're not around. But it won't be cheap." Without hesitation, Ricardo replied, "I'll pay, whatever it takes." Antonio's expression turned serious. "The price might not be what you expect. It could cost more than money." "I don't care," Ricardo said firmly. "I just want to know the truth." The next day, Antonio began his investigation. He was careful and discreet, following Luciana and her friends without raising suspicion. Within a week, he uncovered enough to confirm Ricardo's worst fears. The women weren't just enjoying harmless outings. They were spending nights in Cancun's bars, drinking and dancing with strange men. The deeper Antonio dug, the darker the revelations became. Luciana wasn't merely flirting. She was going home with different men, sometimes twice a week, vanishing into the night and returning only in the early hours of the morning. The pattern was unmistakable. Antonio documented everything, each detail cutting deeper into Ricardo's heart. One evening, after hours at the garage, Antonio approached Ricardo with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, kid," he said quietly. "Your wife, she's not just out partying. She's sleeping with other men. Regularly." Ricardo felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath him, leaving him in freefall. Antonio's revelation wasn't vague or uncertain. It was backed by the kind of meticulous detail that came with experience in his line of work. Seated in the shadowy garage after hours, Antonio's face was firm but tinged with reluctant sympathy. "I didn't come here with just words," Antonio said, his voice steady. From his jacket, he pulled out a small USB drive and a plain brown envelope, placing them on the workbench between them. "Everything you need to know is here. Videos, receipts, timelines. It's all there." Ricardo stared at the objects as if they might explode, his hands trembling as he reached for the envelope. Inside were screenshots of hotel reservations and invoices, each one unmistakably under Luciana's name. The receipts weren't for meals or outings. They were for rooms booked by the hour at hotels scattered across Cancun. "It wasn't a one-time thing," Antonio added, his tone sharp but calm. "Different men, different places. You deserve to know the truth." The USB in Ricardo's hand felt heavier than it should. His gaze drifted to a laptop resting on the workbench, and Antonio gestured toward it. "Take your time," he said, standing. "When you're ready, we'll talk about what comes next." Numbly, Ricardo nodded as Antonio exited the room. He plugged the drive into the laptop, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The first video loaded, and there she was. Luciana, laughing and dancing in a crowded bar, her body pressed against another man's. Clip after clip followed, each more damning than the last. There were grainy images of her entering hotels, holding hands with strangers, her expression carefree in a way Ricardo hadn't seen in years. The timestamps were irrefutable. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, it was a calculated pattern of betrayal. When the final file ended, Ricardo slumped in the chair, staring blankly at the dark screen. The evidence replayed in his mind like a cruel loop. Luciana wasn't just unhappy or distant. She had been living a life that excluded him entirely. Ricardo left the garage in a daze, the weight of the truth suffocating him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove home, the sound of the engine blending with the storm of thoughts in his head. When he walked into the house, he found Luciana in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine, as if nothing had changed. The air in the room felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken tension. "Luciana," Ricardo said, his voice raw and unsteady. "We need to talk." She glanced up, momentarily startled by his tone, but quickly masked her surprise with indifference. "What now?" she asked flatly, her tone dismissive. Ricardo's heart pounded as he moved closer, pulling the printed receipts from his jacket pocket and slamming them onto the coffee table. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "You're not even trying to hide it anymore." Luciana's eyes darted to the papers, her expression faltering for a brief second before she let out a nervous laugh. "What is this, Ricardo? Are you spying on me now? This is ridiculous." She stood abruptly, her voice rising in mock outrage. "You've lost your mind." "Don't lie to me," Ricardo shouted, his voice breaking. "I know everything. The hotels, the men, the lies. I've given everything to this marriage, and this is how you repay me." Luciana's face hardened, her lips curled into a bitter smile as she crossed her arms. "You think you can control me? Dictate my life because you're the one working yourself to death in that garage? I've spent years living by your rules, listening to you and everyone else tell me how to live. I'm done." Ricardo stared at her, disbelief etched into every feature. "Done? You're saying you're done with the life I've been building for us? I've sacrificed everything for you, for us, and this is what I get?" Luciana's expression turned icy, her voice cutting like a blade. "You think I owe you something because you've been playing the hard-working husband? Newsflash, Ricardo. I don't owe you anything. I'm finally living my life on my terms. I won't apologize for that." Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, his voice trembling as he replied, "Your freedom is built on my sacrifices, Luciana. Every late night, every extra hour, I gave all of it to make a life for us. You're tearing it apart and you're acting like it doesn't even matter." Luciana's laugh was hollow, her bitterness palpable. "You think you're some kind of hero. You've been so consumed with your precious garage and your dreams that you didn't even notice I've been miserable for years. I never asked for this life, Ricardo, not once." Ricardo's voice cracked, his pain too overwhelming to contain. "If you've hated this life so much, why didn't you just leave me? Why go behind my back? Why destroy everything we had?" Luciana stepped closer, her face inches from his, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You really want to know why? Because you're weak, Ricardo. You thought I'd stay loyal out of gratitude. You thought I'd be satisfied with the small, pathetic life you've built. But I've outgrown you and this marriage. If you want to leave, go ahead, but don't think for a second that I'll make it easy for you." Her words landed like blows, each one cutting deeper than the last. Ricardo stared at her, the woman he had once loved, now a stranger in every sense. The life he had worked so hard to create was gone, shattered beyond repair, and Luciana's cold defiance left him with nothing but the weight of betrayal. Ricardo stood frozen, disbelief coursing through him. The woman he had poured his heart into, the one he had sacrificed so much for, had just dismantled everything they had built with a few venomous words. Luciana's voice was laced with cruelty as she delivered her final blow. "If you think you'll take a cent from me in a divorce, think again. I'll destroy you. I'll fabricate a domestic offense case so convincing you won't even know what hit you. You'll lose everything. Your garage, your reputation, everything." Her words cut deeper than the betrayal itself. They were not just a threat to his pride, but a calculated attack on everything he held dear. Ricardo didn't respond. His chest heaved, and his legs felt like lead as he turned toward the door. Each step was heavier than the last, but he kept moving. Luciana's voice echoed behind him, taunting him, but he didn't look back. The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside, feeling like a bitter reprieve from the suffocating house. As the door shut behind him, Ricardo knew there was no going back to the life he once knew. Later that night, Ricardo returned to his home. His heart weighed heavily in his chest, and his thoughts were a chaotic mess. Every harsh word Luciana had thrown at him replayed in his mind like a cruel recording. He didn't know where else to go. Despite the pain, his home still felt like the only place he belonged. But as he stepped inside, something felt off. The lights were dim, casting eerie shadows across the room. The air was thick with tension, and unease crept up his spine. He moved toward the living room, but before he could react, a heavy force struck him from behind. Ricardo stumbled forward, his breath knocked out of him as strong hands grabbed him. He tried to fight back, but he was outnumbered. 5 men surrounded him, their faces hard and full of malice. They began beating him mercilessly, Punches and kicks rained down on his ribs, chest, and face. Ricardo's attempts to resist were futile. His head spun, the pain overwhelming his senses. "You thought you could control her," one of the men sneered, driving a fist into Ricardo's side. "She's ours now." Ricardo's vision blurred, blood dripping from his lips as he struggled to comprehend the situation. These weren't strangers. They were Luciana's lovers. One by one, they took turns attacking him, breaking him down both physically and emotionally. When they were done, Ricardo was dragged across the floor, his limbs bound tightly to a chair with rough ropes. His body slumped forward, battered and bruised. Every inch of him ached. Blood soaked his clothes, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Around him, the men's mocking laughter mixed with Luciana's voice, cold and unrecognizable. The love he had once believed in now felt like a cruel illusion. The room closed in on him, suffocating and oppressive. Ricardo's mind raced, desperate for a way out, but there was none. He was immobilized, forced to endure the torment. Then Luciana entered the room wearing a silk robe that barely concealed her figure. Her expression was smug as she surveyed the scene. "Do you see now, Ricardo?" she purred, her voice dripping with mockery. "I'm a goddess. I was never meant for just one man, especially not someone as small and pathetic as you." What followed was a humiliating display designed to crush him further. Luciana turned to the men, her worshippers, and spent the next 2 hours indulging in a sick display of power and control. Ricardo, bloodied and restrained, could do nothing but endure. When it was over, she sauntered back to him, her expression triumphant. "Now, my dear husband, do you see? You're nothing. A mere pawn, my slave. You'll never be more than that." Ricardo, broken but not defeated, sat slumped in the chair. His body ached, his vision blurred, but deep within him, a fire still burned. He clenched his teeth, the taste of blood sharp in his mouth. Despite everything, he forced himself to speak. "If I survive this," he rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. "If I live to see another day—" His eyes, filled with pain but unwavering, locked onto Luciana. The woman he had once loved was now his greatest enemy. "I swear to you," he said, his words dripping with quiet rage, "you will regret this. I will be your worst nightmare. Every ounce of pain you've inflicted on me, I'll return it tenfold." Luciana paused, her smirk faltering for a split second, but she quickly masked it with anger, her eyes narrowing as she glared at him. "You think you can intimidate me?" she snapped. Her voice rose, filled with venom. Turning to the men, she barked, "Teach him another lesson." The men hesitated, startled by the ferocity of her command, but quickly obeyed. They descended on Ricardo again, their fists and feet landing with sickening force. The pain was excruciating, but Ricardo didn't flinch. He didn't beg. Even as his body gave way, his spirit remained defiant. Luciana watched from a distance, her expression twisted with fury. But something about Ricardo's words seemed to linger in the air, unsettling her. She clenched her fists tightly, her frustration evident. Yet she refused to let fear creep in. She had control now, and she wasn't about to let it slip. For Ricardo, the physical pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Even as darkness closed in, he held on to his resolve. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. A reckoning would come, and Ricardo Moreno would make sure of it. The men stepped back, awaiting her signal, but Luciana's expression faltered. Beneath her fury was something she hadn't anticipated. Ricardo's defiant words had struck a nerve she hadn't realized was exposed. Her once smug confidence began to crumble, replaced by a discomfort she couldn't quite place. After the brutal attack, Ricardo's attackers dumped his battered body by the canal, leaving him to the cold night and the rushing water. They walked away without a second glance, certain that he wouldn't make it until morning. To them, he was finished, broken and discarded, a problem solved. But what they didn't know was that Antonio's men had been tailing them the entire time, staying just out of sight. Antonio had suspected things might escalate and had sent his people to intervene if needed. When they found Ricardo barely clinging to life, they moved quickly. With quiet precision, they pulled him from the canal and loaded him into a van, ensuring no one saw them. The van sped through the night, taking Ricardo to a secure warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Antonio was already there, his face set with grim determination as he waited. When the van doors opened, revealing Ricardo's limp form, Antonio didn't hesitate. "Get a doctor, now," he ordered, his voice firm but laced with relief. The men carefully placed Ricardo on a table, mindful of his fragile state. Minutes later, the doctor arrived and began his work, methodically cleaning Ricardo's wounds and assessing the damage. "He's in rough shape," the doctor murmured, shaking his head as he worked, But he's alive. That alone is remarkable. Antonio didn't leave the warehouse. He paced relentlessly, pressing the doctor for updates. Hours passed before Ricardo's eyelids fluttered open. His vision was hazy, and pain shot through his body with every attempt to move. "Stay still," Antonio said softly, stepping closer. "You're alive, Ricardo. You're going to be okay." Ricardo blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. I survived," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The doctor nodded, his tone professional yet reassuring. "You've been through hell, but you're tougher than you look. Rest now, you've earned it." Memories of the attack began flooding back, and Ricardo's expression darkened. His voice cracked as he muttered, "Luciana, she let them do this to me." Antonio's jaw tightened, his face a mask of restrained anger. "She'll answer for it," he said firmly. "But first, you need to heal. There's a bigger fight ahead, Ricardo. One you can't face like this." Exhaustion overtook him, and Ricardo closed his eyes, letting the weight of his injuries pull him into unconsciousness. Though his body was broken, his spirit remained intact. He vowed silently that this wasn't the end. Luciana and her accomplices wouldn't get away with it. 2 days later, while Ricardo recovered in the warehouse, Luciana continued her life as though nothing had happened. She remained blissfully unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble. That afternoon, she strolled into the bank to check her accounts, already planning a lavish shopping spree. But when she swiped her card, the machine displayed an error. Puzzled, she tried again, only to see the same message. Card declined. Confused and uneasy, she pulled out her phone to check her account balances. Her jaw dropped as every balance read 0. Her accounts were frozen. Panic set in, and she frantically tried to call the bank, but the lines were busy. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from her lawyer. The text was brief and chilling. "You must vacate the house immediately. Ownership has been transferred to a Mr. Gabriel." Luciana froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. Her first instinct was denial. This had to be a mistake. Fueled by adrenaline, she rushed home to confirm the message was wrong. When she arrived, she found a stranger standing at the front door, suitcase in hand. "You'll need to leave," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "This house now belongs to Mr. Gabriel." Luciana's face drained of color. "What are you talking about? This is my home. I've lived here for years. There's no way—" The man interrupted, holding out official paperwork. "It's all here. The property has been legally transferred. You have until the end of the day to vacate." Her heart raced, panic clawing at her chest. "Who the hell is Gabriel?" she shouted, her voice rising in desperation. The man didn't respond, simply stepping aside to let her process the reality. Furious and disoriented, Luciana stormed away, determined to uncover who was behind this. She couldn't fathom how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. Deep down, a nagging suspicion began to form. Could Ricardo have done this? She dismissed the thought immediately. He wouldn't dare, would he? Her panic gave way to a simmering rage as she vowed to find answers. But what she didn't know was that Ricardo, the man she had left for dead, was still alive, and he was already planning his next move. Luciana drove to the garage, hoping for a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. When she arrived, her breath caught in her throat. The doors were locked, and a small sign hung prominently on the door, "Property sold." Beneath it, the name of the new owner was listed, Gabriel. For a moment, Luciana couldn't move. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her hands trembled and her mind raced. Everything she'd leaned on, every ounce of security she thought she had, was crumbling. She didn't know who Gabriel was, but she was certain of one thing. This was no coincidence. Ricardo was alive, and somehow he was behind all of it. Anger surged within her, mingling with panic. She felt cornered, helpless. Her thoughts spiraled as she pulled out her phone and dialed one of her lovers, desperate for some kind of comfort or distraction. When he answered, his voice was calm but tinged with concern. "Luciana, what's going on?" "Just come get me," she said, her voice shaky and raw. "I need to get out of here." Within minutes, he arrived, and she left without even glancing back at the house she'd once called home. The drive was tense and silent, her mind a storm of emotions. Everything, her accounts, her home, the garage, had been taken from her in a matter of days. He brought her to his place, a secluded house she had visited before under different circumstances. This time it felt heavier, more like a temporary escape than a haven. She slumped onto his couch, her body sagging under the weight of exhaustion. "What happened?" he asked, sitting beside her, his tone steady but curious. She hesitated before the words poured out in a torrent. She told him everything. The frozen bank accounts, the house being taken, the garage sold, all orchestrated by Ricardo, who she had thought was gone for good. She admitted how she had underestimated him, pushing him away until she could no longer control the fallout. Her lover listened intently, but a flicker of something colder crossed his face. Luciana had once relished the thrill of these affairs, the excitement of being with someone forbidden, but now even his presence felt hollow, a reminder of how quickly things had unraveled. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice firm. "You can't let it end here." Luciana met his gaze, her expression hardening. Her thoughts were consumed by Ricardo. He had survived, turned the tables, and stripped her of everything she valued. Fury bubbled up again, fierce and consuming. "I won't let him win," she said through clenched teeth, more to herself than to him. But beneath her anger lurked a deeper unease. She could feel the situation spiraling into something darker, something far beyond her control. 3 weeks had passed since Ricardo's near-fatal beating. In that time, the warehouse Antonio had taken him to became his sanctuary. It was here, far from prying eyes, that Ricardo rebuilt himself, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Under Antonio's relentless guidance, he transformed into a version of himself he never thought possible. Antonio's training was grueling. Ricardo learned to handle tools of all kinds, tools, knives, and even machetes. He practiced how to clean, maintain, and wield them with precision. The lessons pushed him to his limits, breaking down his old self and building something stronger in its place. This was no longer about fixing cars or dreaming of a peaceful life. It was about survival and reclaiming what was his. Over the weeks, Ricardo's body grew leaner, his movements more purposeful. His mind sharpened, each training session forging him into someone unrecognizable. He was no longer a victim or a mechanic weighed down by betrayal. He had become a man of intent, prepared to fight for what was taken from him. Finally, Antonio decided it was time for Ricardo to meet the man behind the curtain, Gabriel. Years ago, Gabriel had quietly financed Ricardo's garage, a seemingly generous gesture. But now it was clear Gabriel was no ordinary businessman. He was a powerful figure in the criminal underworld, a man whose reach extended across the city. Gabriel had been watching Ricardo's progress from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to bring him into the fold. The meeting took place in one of Gabriel's private properties, a dimly lit room that exuded authority and control. Gabriel sat behind a massive oak desk, his demeanor calm yet commanding. His sharp gaze lingered on Ricardo, assessing him like a craftsman appraising his work. "You've come a long way," Gabriel said, his voice deep and deliberate. "I've seen how hard you've worked, how much you've endured. Now we stand at a crossroads. You have decisions to make, Ricardo." Ricardo stood tall, his posture steady and unwavering. His hands rested at his sides, brushing against the tools that had become an extension of him. He understood the weight of what was being offered and the cost of stepping forward. "I've already made my choice," Ricardo said, his voice firm. Gabriel leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good, because from here on out, there's no turning back." In that moment, Ricardo knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer the man he once was. The path ahead was treacherous, but he was ready to face it, and to ensure that everyone who had betrayed him paid the price. Gabriel leaned back slightly, his gaze narrowing as he scrutinized Ricardo. "You've hit rock bottom. Your wife betrayed you, your pride is in tatters, and your home is gone. But now you have a choice," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "You can start over, file for divorce, walk away, and leave Luciana behind. You'll be free of her, free of everything she's done to you." Gabriel paused, letting the words sink in before his tone turned colder. "Or you can choose vengeance. But understand, Ricardo, revenge is a one-way street. If you go down this road, you won't be the same man. You'll have to abandon your humanity. You'll become someone who lives by the code of the streets, a butcher's." The weight of the decision hung in the air like a storm cloud. This wasn't a simple choice. It was a turning point, one that would shape the rest of Ricardo's life. Gabriel's words were clear. There was no going back. Ricardo didn't flinch. He had already made up his mind. The fire inside him burned hotter than ever, fueled not by a desire for justice, but by a thirst for retribution. His old life, filled with dreams of peace and family, was gone. All that remained was the need to make Luciana pay. "I know what I want," Ricardo said, his voice calm but firm. "I choose revenge. For what she's done to me, for destroying everything I built. I'll do whatever it takes to make her suffer." Gabriel studied him, his face unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "So be it," he said, His tone was as cold as ice. But remember this, revenge will consume you. It requires strength, focus, and the will to do what others won't. If you hesitate, if you falter, you'll fail. Ricardo's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through him. Fear had no place in his mind, only certainty. Luciana had taken everything from him, and now it was her turn to lose. As Gabriel's calculating eyes lingered on him, Ricardo felt the finality of his choice settle in. His path was set, and there was no turning back. Luciana sat on the couch in her lover's dimly lit apartment, her thoughts in turmoil. She had spent the day seeking solace in his company, trying to escape the storm her life had become. But no amount of distraction could erase the gnawing feeling in her chest. Ricardo was still out there, silent and looming like a shadow. She had underestimated him once, and now the weight of that mistake pressed down on her like a vice. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. She froze. Visitors were rare here, and something about the timing felt off. When she opened the door, no one was there. Only a small package wrapped in bright red paper sitting on the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. The wrapping was too familiar. Ricardo used to give her gifts in paper just like this. Luciana hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked it up. She untied the strings slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. When she opened the box, her worst fears were confirmed. Inside was a severed male organ, meticulously wrapped in tissue paper. The sight made her stomach churn, bile rising in her throat. Her hands shook as she pulled out a note tucked beside the gruesome gift. The scrawled words in bold black ink sent ice through her veins. "You've unleashed hell. 1 down, 4 to go. Call the cops, and you're next." Luciana's vision blurred. Her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing, but the meaning was clear. Ricardo wasn't coming back to beg for forgiveness or to plead for reconciliation. He was coming for vengeance, and he had already started. She stumbled backward, dropping the note as her chest tightened with panic. The apartment, which had once felt like a haven, now seemed suffocating and oppressive. Her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps as the edges of her vision darkened. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor. Before the darkness took her, one terrifying thought consumed her mind. What have I done? When Luciana regained consciousness, her lover knelt beside her, his face pale with worry. She struggled to sit up, her head pounding and her body weak from the shock. His voice was distant at first, but his next words snapped her back to reality. "Diego's dead," he said, his tone tight with fear. "They found his body just outside the city. Whoever did it, they made sure it was brutal." Luciana's blood ran cold. Diego was part of their small, tangled circle of lovers, a man she had once trusted. Now he was dead, and his murder confirmed what she had been too afraid to admit. Someone was coming for them, and it wasn't just anyone. It was Ricardo. Her mind spiraled as her lover's words echoed in her ears, fear mixed with guilt and anger, swirling into a storm of emotions. Ricardo had survived, and he was dismantling her life piece by piece. This wasn't the man she had once manipulated and betrayed. This was someone else entirely, someone she had created through her own actions. The realization hit her like a blow. Ricardo wasn't playing games. He was delivering judgment, and there would be no escape. Luciana sat silently, her trembling hands reaching for the red box left on the table. Her fingers shook as she opened it once more, dreading what she already knew was inside. The grotesque contents and the menacing note sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. The message was crystal clear. This was personal, and whoever was behind it wanted her to feel the fear. The walls of the apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. She wasn't safe here. Not anymore. Her lover's expression hardened as he read the note again. He made a quick, decisive move. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "If they did this to Diego, we're next. We have to leave now." Luciana nodded without argument. She knew he was right. Ricardo wasn't just angry, he was relentless, and the consequences of pushing him too far were spiraling out of control. They hastily packed what little they could and fled the apartment, speeding away in his car, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the city. They headed toward Bacalar, a remote town known for its serene lagoons. It was far enough to offer a brief reprieve, or so they hoped. Upon arriving, they found a modest, run-down motel on the town's outskirts. Its isolation felt like a refuge, a small haven away from the chaos they had left behind. But peace was fleeting. That night, as darkness enveloped the town and silence filled the air, A sharp knock on their door shattered the quiet. Luciana froze, her heart racing as her lover cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. Outside, resting on the ground, was another box. The sight of it made Luciana's stomach drop like a lead weight. Her lover hesitated before bringing the box inside. Luciana's hands trembled as she watched him untie the string and lift the lid. This time the contents were even more horrifying. 6 balls, carefully wrapped in dark cloth. Her breath caught in her throat, her vision swimming with terror. But the note that accompanied the gruesome package was what sent chills coursing through her veins. She read it aloud, her voice trembling. "For your necklace. You can run to the ends of the earth, but I will always be there." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. The small motel room felt colder, the walls closing in around them. Luciana's lover grabbed her shoulders, his pale face betraying his fear. "We have to leave, now," he said, panic rising in his voice. But Luciana knew deep down it was too late. Running wouldn't save them. Ricardo had become something unstoppable, a force far beyond anything she had anticipated. For the next 3 days, Luciana remained locked inside the motel room, consumed by a paralyzing fear that refused to let her rest. The once neutral walls now felt like a prison. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every creak or shadow outside sent her heart racing. News of Alejandro, Juan, and Daniel's brutal deaths weighed heavily on her, each one a stark reminder that the noose around her was tightening. Her lover, Emiliano, paced the room restlessly, glued to his phone, anxiously awaiting updates. Though he spoke little, the tension between them was suffocating. The weight of what they had unleashed pressed on both of them. On the 4th day, Emiliano decided to leave. "I'll get us something to eat," he said, his voice strained as he stepped out. Hours passed, but he didn't return. The silence in the room grew unbearable as the clock mocked Luciana with every tick. A sense of dread clawed at her chest, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. After 3 agonizing hours, Luciana couldn't sit still any longer. She grabbed the car keys and burst out of the motel room, the hot desert air slapping her face. Her mind was racing. Emiliano was in danger. She was certain of it. She climbed into the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and sped off. The further she drove, the emptier the world became. The arid expanse of the landscape stretched endlessly before her, the horizon blurred by heat. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, convinced someone was following her. Anxiety pressed against her chest, suffocating her as her thoughts spun wildly. Her car sped toward the vast, barren Chihuahuan desert. Something about its emptiness felt magnetic, like a place where everything could disappear, including her. As the isolation of the desert swallowed her surroundings, she felt a strange mix of dread and comfort. The vast nothingness offered no answers, only the illusion of escape. The highway stretched endlessly into the haze of the horizon. The silence inside the car became deafening, amplifying the weight of everything that had happened. Ricardo's vengeance, the bodies piling up, the unrelenting fear, it all bore down on her, suffocating and inescapable. With each passing mile, the gravity of her situation pulled her further away from hope. The world blurred around her, but Luciana knew there was no outrunning what awaited her. The city was long gone, its distant glow swallowed by the horizon. Now, only the barren expanse of the Chihuahuan desert lay ahead. The car roared forward as Luciana gripped the wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the endless road. Her mind churned with one relentless thought. She wasn't just fleeing the city, she was running from the consequences of her own making. But no matter how fast she drove, she couldn't escape the shadow closing in behind her. The road stretched out endlessly, a path that felt less like salvation and more like a descent into the chaos she had unleashed. Hours later, the car sputtered to a stop. Out of fuel and options, Luciana was forced to continue on foot. Each step through the harsh desert terrain was a battle against exhaustion. Her legs felt like lead, her throat burned with thirst, and the searing sun bore down mercilessly. The horizon shimmered in the heat, an endless, unforgiving expanse of sand and scrub. Her breaths were labored, her chest heaving as she pushed herself forward, every fiber of her being screaming for her to stop. 2 hours of grueling trudging passed, and her strength began to fail. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground, the hot sand scorching her skin. But just as despair began to swallow her whole, she saw it, a glimmer on the horizon. A mirage, surely, but desperation gave her hope. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching as she staggered toward the shimmering image. Her arms outstretched, she reached for it, only to find nothing but empty air. The vision dissolved, leaving her gasping and broken. Collapsing once more, she choked on sobs that refused to come. Her body convulsed with exhaustion, and her mind teetered on the edge of surrender. But then, through the haze, something real appeared. A black SUV loomed in the distance, its silhouette cutting through the rippling air. Luciana's breath caught, her pulse quickening. Was it real, or another cruel trick? She could barely keep her eyes open as the sound of an engine approached, drawing closer until the vehicle stopped beside her. The doors opened, and for a moment, all was silent, save for the swirling dust. Then with a heavy thud, something cold and wet landed in her lap. Luciana blinked, trying to focus. When her eyes finally adjusted, a scream caught in her throat. Emiliano's severed head rested there, his lifeless eyes staring up at her. Blood streaked his pale face, his hair matted and sticky with crimson. His expression was frozen in terror, his mouth slightly agape as if his final moments had been spent begging for mercy. Luciana's hands trembled as she clutched the grotesque reminder of his fate. The SUV didn't linger. Its doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Luciana sat frozen, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. Her body was too weak to cry, her throat too dry to scream. The blood soaked through her clothes, burning her skin like fire. The desert around her felt more isolating than ever. Emiliano's head, once part of the man who had been her refuge, was now her only companion. The realization hit her like a wave. She had triggered this nightmare, and there was no escape. Ricardo's revenge wasn't just cruel, it was relentless. Time slipped away as Luciana remained motionless, staring at the lifeless face in her lap. She tried to move, but her body refused. The oppressive heat bore down on her as she struggled to her feet, her vision swimming with exhaustion and grief. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The sun showed no mercy. Her legs buckled beneath her as she stumbled forward, her body giving out little by little. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. Her mind, a fog of fear and desperation, clung to one impossible thought: escape. Just as her strength failed her again, she saw something. Someone. Ricardo. His silhouette stood against the endless desert, his figure clear despite the rippling heat. Hope flared in her chest, and she forced herself to move. "It's him," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible. "He found me." Her steps quickened, her heart pounding as she reached out to him. But as she neared, his figure wavered, then vanished. Another mirage. The despair that followed crushed her like a wave. She stumbled, her legs giving way, and collapsed into the sand once more. The ground beneath her shifted, and before she could react, she fell. The earth seemed to open up, swallowing her whole. She landed hard in a narrow pit, her body twisted awkwardly, the impact leaving her dazed. For several long moments, she lay motionless, the world spinning around her. The harsh desert sun felt distant now, its oppressive heat replaced by the cold shadows of the pit. Luciana's mind struggled to catch up, her thoughts fractured and incoherent. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. Her hands fumbled against the dirt walls, but her strength was gone. All she could do was lie there, alone and defeated, the consequences of her actions pressing down on her like the weight of the earth itself. The shadow stretched over her like a final judgment. Ricardo stood at the edge of the pit, his figure towering above her, his eyes cold and devoid of any humanity. Luciana's mouth opened, but her cracked, parched lips betrayed her. No words came out. She wanted to plead, to beg for mercy, but her throat, dry and raw, refused to cooperate. All she could do was stare at him. The man she once knew, the man who had once held her heart. But that man was gone. What stood before her now was a specter of vengeance, a relentless force stripped of love or forgiveness. Ricardo remained motionless for a moment, his gaze unyielding as he looked down at her. Then without a word, he raised his hand and gestured. The desert responded. The ground began to tremble, and the sand shifted, at first in small ripples, then with increasing ferocity. Like a tide obeying its master, the sand poured into the pit, cascading toward her in an unstoppable torrent. "No! Please, Ricardo, stop!" Luciana's scream tore through the air, hoarse and desperate, but the sound was swallowed by the desert's relentless roar. The grains of sand encased her legs, pressing against her, climbing higher and higher. Her chest heaved as panic set in, but there was no escape. The suffocating weight of the sand crushed against her body, filling her lungs, choking her as it rose. Ricardo remained still, a shadow unmoved by her cries, his silhouette unwavering as the sand continued to bury her. Her vision blurred, her strength fading. She clawed at the encroaching grains, but her feeble attempts were no match for the desert's power. The world narrowed, the light dimming as darkness overtook her. Ricardo's form lingered above her, the last image she saw before the abyss claimed her entirely. Ricardo was no longer the man he once was. The one who had loved, dreamed, and wished for a simple, peaceful life had vanished. In his place stood Cazador del Desierto, the desert hunter, a name whispered with fear by anyone who had the misfortune of knowing it. His eyes, once warm and full of hope, were now as barren as the desert he called home. Gabriel had reshaped him, turning him into something cold, ruthless, and unrecognizable. Ricardo had shed his old self entirely when he embraced his new identity. The desert became his domain, a harsh and unforgiving landscape where he hunted without mercy and struck with lethal precision. To the outside world, Ricardo was no longer a man, but a legend, a shadow that haunted the desert and the criminal underworld alike. As a lieutenant in Gabriel's cartel, his name was spoken in hushed tones, feared by both enemies and allies. He showed no hesitation when ending a life, whether with a Colt, a blade, or his bare hands. Blood stained his path, but he carried no regret. The desert hunter knew no pity, no hesitation, no remorse. His loyalty to Gabriel was absolute. In exchange for his transformation, Gabriel had given him power, wealth, and purpose. Ricardo repaid that debt with unwavering service, executing each mission with ruthless efficiency. His reputation grew with every liquidate, cementing his place as one of Gabriel's most trusted enforcers. Each act of violence pushed him further from the man he had once been. His humanity had been buried beneath the weight of bloodshed and vengeance. The pain of his past no longer drove him. It had been replaced by the cold clarity of destruction. In the harsh, unforgiving desert, Cazador del Desierto was more than a man. He was a force of nature, as inevitable as the scalding winds and relentless sun. His name became a ghost story whispered by men who once believed they were untouchable. But when confronted with the desert hunter, their arrogance dissolved into terror. Ricardo's transformation was complete. The life he once lived, the love he had once felt, was gone, buried beneath layers of sand and brutality. He had become the monster he vowed to be, the ultimate embodiment of the vengeance that had consumed him. And the desert, vast and eternal, bore silent witness to the legend of the man who had become its most ruthless predator.